Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to the Lifetime Training Talks podcast. And I've got the one and only founder of IOM, Institute of Motion, and ViPR Pro. He's been a longtime friend, and I've learned just an absolute ton from him. His name is Michol Dalcourt. He's been a guest on the show before. Today, we're going to talk about an amazing topic that's going to cover everything from athletes all the way to the older population. And it's this concept of becoming unbreakable. And I want to just kick it off, Moose, and just, would you mind sharing what your thoughts are and what you've learned over the years through all the people that you've learned from about what that means?
Well, it may mean different things to different people. It is basically an aspirational thing. So let me just perhaps start there. Is if I was to suggest that, we navigate life and our experiences, whatever they would be, and we could be as unbreakable as possible. That may mean for the youngster that's trying to crack the lineup of sport, that they're on the field, they're in the play, they're achieving a high level of athleticism. But if I said unbreakable and you and I are 75, it may mean, hey, I'm living an independent life. I'm not in a home. I'm not in a nursing care facility or an aged care facility. And I'm navigating some level of independence. So across the spectrum of lifespan, this idea of being unbreakable is pretty aspirational. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing realistically is we're all breakable. But what we want to do is we want to be as unbreakable as possible. So the idea of physiology is, can we bend without breaking, right? And adaptation wise, we always think about overreaching, right? So we introduce an overreaching stress. The body takes that as a perturbation, as a signal, and it takes that signal. It comes back to where it once was, which is resiliency. And if it adapts beyond that and gets more capable, we call that anti-fragile. We call that super compensation. We call that an adaptive process. And it's that kind of milieu is where we think about the idea of being unbreakable. Can we give some sort of introduction to an input, a stressor, some sort of input to us? And can we have the body deal with that and then adapt because of that and get better? And if we can do that in a logical, mindful way, not just physically, by the way, but if we can look at the facets of what make us healthy, and we can achieve these kind of overreaching things, these adaptive aspects, in total, we give ourselves the best opportunity to be unbreakable. And, that's what you and I wanted to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, so the normal, when I say normal, the everyday person is going to look and say, yep, that's what I do when I train. I lift the bar and, I do all the different movement patterns and, whether it's functional, whatever your shtick is.
Yeah.
And that's what will make me unbreakable. But at the end of the day, we all know, and we've all been working out for a long time, where we know that that's not necessarily true. So would you mind diving into your methodology and your philosophy from a programming and training standpoint that really, I think, gets to how unique this information in this podcast is going to be with regard to training?
Stella, can I start broad and then narrow in?
Yeah, for sure.
Can I share my screen?
Or how about no? No, I'm just kidding.
No.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine. If you said that, I would have said, no problem. We'll dive right into physical because
no. I'm kidding. Yeah. Totally kidding. Yeah. Share that.
You have to enable me to share my screen, but here's kind of, you're saying that tongue in cheek, but a lot of times what you're really saying is, we are generally thinking only of the physical realm, right? Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yeah. And real quick, those that are just listening to the podcast, again, go over to the YouTube channel. You'll be able to see these slides in person as well, but we'll talk through it as well.
I will describe this if those are just in audio mode. For those that are just listening in, I'll describe this as best I can. Mm-hmm. So we are an applied health and human performance company. And what that means is we look at health and we look at performance. So to kind of get to your question about how do we look at things, that's how we look at things, right? So in health, we got fitness and we got wellness. Are you fit? Do you go to the gym? Are you a health seeker? That sort of thing. Are you well? And the wellness I'll get into in a second. Performance could be athletic, which is I'm trying to achieve, some sort of athletic prowess through my life. Lifestyle performance is I want to unlock potential. A lot of listeners out there, a lot of clients out there, they are not athletes, but they want to unlock potential. And we do that through lifestyle performance. And then we've got organizational performance. We coach organizations to infuse wellness and well-being into the ecosystem that they are in.
Yeah, Moose, one other thing too is and unless I completely had a mind block, I don't remember you explaining wellness. And would you mind make sure that you cover that? Because that's a big piece on the health side.
Absolutely. So for those that can see this, we're looking at determinants of health. For those that are just in audio mode, we look at health and health outcomes. What determines your health is two sides of a house, right? So on the one side, there are social determinants of health. And that is the ecosystem in which I live and the ecosystem in which I interact with. So if I'm in, if I'm in a well-to-do society and I interact with, a lot of access to stuff, I generally have better health outcomes by and large because I've got access to more stuff. And if I'm born into that, well, good for me. If I'm not, then what we need to do is navigate a different experience. So that's social determinants of health. And they are very deterministic of our health outcomes, but largely they are outside our individual locus of control, right? I'm born into this society, whether it's marginalized communities or whether it's well-to-do. And I interact with them. On the other side of the house, and this goes to your questions, are the individual determinants of health. There are many, but the three main ones are physical, which I'll expand on in a second, mental, emotional / spiritual. I don't necessarily mean religious, but spiritual. So that's the second bucket, mental, emotional, spiritual. And then the third bucket is social and individual economic, right? So the economic status of the individual, that's the third bucket. And therein lies the wellness of the individual. So there is wellness aspects, which are generalized health in physical, mental, emotional, and social, right? Primarily. I can have health outcomes, which is I'm well in each of those buckets. Equally, there's a performance edge to each of these buckets as well, right? And I'll dissect that in a second. So wellness and the idea of how we look at training and how we look at the introduction of fitness and being and having high performance, right? A performance style life is ingrained and anchored into these aspects. So if we look at this, for instance, we might dissect physical in how I stress physically through exercise or activities of daily living, how I recover through sleep and other biohack protocols, and my nutritional status. So that could be hydration, micro, macronutrient intake. So I can be healthy and well in that bucket, or I can perform in that bucket, which means I'm dialing everything in perhaps to a different level, right? I'm taking nutrient timing. I'm looking at different types of workouts to create metabolic flexibility, to create variable responses in terms of my ability not only to move, but to engage in useful biomotor outcomes. So it's much more dialed in. We'll call that the performance side. Or I'm just, I'm generally living my life well. I'm walking my dog. And, that's the difference in wellness and, kind of lifestyle performance. They're both good, but it's just at what level of willpower and focus and attention do you want to put in this physical bucket? That's one of them. We can talk about it. The next bucket is mental, emotional / spiritual. And I can be well in those ones, which means I've got a generally positive mindset. I'm generally anchored to purpose and value in my life and my contributions. And my thoughts, feelings, and actions are typically commensurate or consistent with, a good flavor of I'm well. Performance in that would be a performance mindset. It's really achieving different desires in terms of outcomes mentally as a focus, perhaps even spiritually. So again, there's well and there's performance. And then the social economic one is the last bucket. And that's all about relationships and about security. What are my relationships with my friends, my family, and myself, right? That I can have well approaches to that, or I can have performance outcomes. The difference is I've got good relationships with myself, my family, and my friends. Social performance might be I'm a pillar of my community. The community leans on me for support, right? That is social performance. Economic, same thing. So we're looking at security and depth and quality of relationship. Do I have relational security? Do I have economic security in my life? Performance economically could be, I'm achieving high outcomes of economic status. So all of that inform wellness. All of that inform this idea of being unbreakable. Being unbreakable is, do I have capacity and outcomes in physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social economic? And if we can do that, we are living a great life. And if I really want to be unbreakable, I need to address each of these facets in ways that are positive towards my outcomes.
Got it. And would you say that, and again, this is kind of the high level overview of where everything, and then we could dive into a bit more. We'll focus probably more on the physical today.
Yep.
But in looking at the three, obviously everybody's going to be on a spectrum of what is my priority, right? Is it a bit more physical than mental emotional, or is it a bit more mental emotional than physical, or is it socioeconomic relationships, things like that? Would you be able to put a priority on one or the other, to say, hey, most things are going to start here, and then where that goes, these other things will go?
Yes, that's a great question. A couple things. The easiest way to answer that question is, where is going to be the least amount of roadblocks, right? So if the access point for me is physical, so for instance, let's say I went through COVID and I've got, I'm lacking mental health, and I'm certainly lacking social health, right? Because this idea of socially distance and shelter in place, if I said to you these terms 3 years ago, you'd say, it doesn't sound healthy, right? We didn't even know those terms in that order 3 years ago, right? We knew the words, but not that lexicon, not that phrasing, right? So, it doesn't sound healthy, and it wasn't healthy mentally and socially. We knew that going in, but we had to mitigate the physical risks, et cetera. So, all right, so here we are. And let's say the easiest access point I have was and is physical. I approach my workouts, I approach my recovery with some intention, and I'm relatively good at my nutritional intake. That could be an access point. Now, here's the thing. Does that affect mood, mental status? Yes. Can that affect my social status? Yes. Because if I go to a facility, a Lifetime, and I work out and I do a small group, large group, I'm just in a social circle, let's say, I'm not necessarily within a group, maybe. Those aspects kind of bleed into my world through the access point of physical, right? So I'm doing something physically, endorphins are released, cytokines are released, endocannabinoids are released. Is that going to affect my mood positively? Yes. So I get tentacles into these other buckets by virtue of one of those buckets. So we don't have to say, I got to solve all of them, I got to address all of them. No, you start where you start, and knowing that little small nudges get me towards that. So I might say, hey, my access point is physical, but I want to increase my social health, right? I want to kind of be around people. I've been stuck in my house forever. Maybe I do a little small group at at Lifetime. Maybe I engage in a little bit of talking to members at the gym. Just, hi, how you doing?
And the question, and I love how you answered that too, because again, this podcast probably a bit more trainer focused, is I think sometimes as trainers, we get so isolated into, I train you, maybe I do nutrition, and then I'm done. And, obviously the benefits of working, at a Lifetime where you have all of these different social opportunities, from Aurora now, which is our healthy aging group, to pickleball, to tennis, to, group training, to group exercise, like Pilates, cafe, coffee talks, whatever it is, that is all aspects of this third pillar, of becoming unbreakable and living a healthy longevity, filled life.
But you said it perfectly. Let's stop it with personal trainer. If I have a personal trainer, that is social health, because one could distill social health with find an individual or a series of individuals to help you through life. Often there's research cited to say that married folks on average live longer than non-married folks. One of the reasons is you find a partner to help you through life. That is social health. If I have a trainer, guess what? I got it. So just by engaging in, let's say, physical with a trainer, I got two of the buckets covered, which is I'm engaging in a well thought out physical approach to stuff, but I'm also getting social health because it is relational quality. I'm finding someone to help me through life or in an aspect of life. That's good. That's really good for health outcomes. And that is the ecosystem that is around what you're building out with all of the programs and all the facets within the physical spaces that Lifetime has. That can anchor into an operating system.
Yep. And the other thing too, I want to pinpoint, because I think this is the area where a lot of trainers get a little squirmish and maybe they associate it with the sales, but I would argue that the purpose, mindset, emotional side are having those conversations and understanding what their vision is currently of themselves or what they want it to be into the future and the power that that has. And I think a lot of trainers fail to really allow the person to noodle and think about those things versus them interjecting what they think is good for them. And what they think is good for them is, obviously that recommendation, but them noodling on it and being able to come up with their own vision, and then us as trainers going in and trying to lead them down the path to getting there is, God, just so powerful.
So well said, Jason, so well said. Let me give you an example off of that.
Yep.
Let's say you're having a conversation with me as a trainer and you're not leading me in any direction. You're trying to find out who I am. And by asking me questions, you find out, let's say, that I love animals. And I lost my dog, which I did last summer. I'm gonna try not to cry here, but I lost my dog, Black Lab, last summer. And let's say by inquiry, you realize, okay, you're really, that's part of your, values, and that's part of your purpose, and you love dogs. Let's say, right? And you say, wow, that's interesting. You ever thought about walking some dogs at the local animal shelter? And I think, wow, I never even thought of that before. And you're thinking, I already know the logic, the mental model of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social, economic. Let's say as a trainer, you know that. And you're leading me down this path by asking questions. I'm walking the path, but you're opening the path up for me with these questions. And then you say, why don't you do that? So now by walking these dogs that are not mine, I'm getting my steps in. There's the physical bucket. Mentally and emotionally, I'm anchoring to purpose and this idea of giving back. How unbreakable do I become when I anchor into purpose, right? We all been there before. Like, I am taking these animals that don't have any outlet and I'm walking them. And, before they go back into that animal shelter, and I feel purpose filled when I do that. And let's say I do it with a few other folks. There's my social bucket. I got all three buckets. And then, the lead would be, okay, as a personal trainer, you might take the lead on my physical bucket from there. But all those other buckets are bolstering my ability to be healthy and to be unbreakable, because now I'm anchoring into purpose. So now when I go in the gym and train with you, I got a purpose beyond just, a little thing. And that purpose drives. And so, everything that I do is much more filled with willpower and stick-to-itiveness and, my willingness to stay with the program is bolstered and ratcheted up because all these other facets are in play. And all you did was lead me down that path.
What I'd love to do is kind of skew this bit more towards that physical side. And I know that, obviously IOM has their programming model of the 4Q. And what I would love for you to do is kind of give an overview of how, one, understanding what that is and the importance of it. Because there's still people today that get so caught up in, I train my clients this way. And it's, I teach the hinge and I teach the squat and the lunge and the push and the pull and, that, and it's pretty conventional, what I would say. And then they think anything unconventional isn't as effective or isn't science, or you get into this debate, right? So can you tie in the concept of becoming unbreakable in the physical side of it with the 4Q model?
Sure. So this is actually a perfect segue. Can you still see my slides?
Yes.
So for those that are listening in, we're just teeing up on more of the physical realm. So we've talked about a broad base of health, but let's dive right in. Let's go more narrow into the physical bucket, which is typically the one that we play in the most typically. So if we look at physical health, it all comes down to this: the aging process, decay, decline, death of a cell or a system, all tracks along the same waterfall. And the waterfall is this: a loss of adaptability leads to functional impairment, which leads to death, right? And that could be cell death, right? Or that could be system death. But it all comes down to a loss of adaptability. Can your body adapt? And if your body can adapt well, you can bend without breaking, and that's unbreakable. So let's go into the ideologies that are in fitness in front of us right now. So if I'm at a camp and I say, never do aerobic exercise because it kills your gains, it's like, really? Right? That is a very narrow viewpoint of things, right? Because what we're looking at is, yes, in the interim of I'm doing something that is growth enhancing, I'm going through the pathways of growth, there may be some interference, right, with aerobic pathways that interfere with growth pathways, but that is actually by itself useful. Interference is not necessarily bad. Our body takes interference and tries to deal with it. And if I can deal with it effectively, I gain adaptability. And that gain of adaptability in the sum total makes me more unbreakable, right? So we often look at the body in sound bites. We approach training in sound bites. And so let me offer this up.
Typically other people's sound bites.
Typically, but and that's a very narrow viewpoint, right? So let's look at the gym and the farm, right? It's a very anecdotal, but it's certainly evidenced in what people have experienced, which is I go to the gym and I engage in sagittally playing dominant exercises for strength, right? And I can, as load goes up, degrees of freedom go down, right? There's an inverse relationship there. So I can maximally load in the gym and I can respect the sagittal plane, which is awesome. And I can load it up and I'm getting strong. Cool. And then you go into life, right? And most of life, we deal with submaximal loads with high degrees of freedom, right? So we move in all sorts of different ways. We do chores, we do everything else. And farm kids did this forever. So they dealt with all these submaximal loads and they're baling hay and they're throwing bales of hay everywhere, right? It's just random stuff, right? Random movement patterns organized around the task of life, right? Task-based outcomes. And so they're putting, a bale of hay in the wagon, then they load the next one beside it, then the next one on top of it. And every rep is different than the previous rep. So highly randomized, highly variable, and a lot of submaximal loading. And what they did is they started to remodel their bodies in a highly adaptable way, where the gym kid is very, let's say, rigid, right? They're doing repetitions, they're mechanistic, it looks the same. Nothing wrong with that. It's great.
And that's the way it's supposed to be done.
It's
right?
and yeah, sure. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to say is, if you can do both, how unbreakable do you become? It's not one the other. It's not one versus the other. It's one and the other. Because if you ever get a farm kid to wrestle a gym kid, advantage farm kid. If you ever get a farm kid inside the gym with the gym kid, advantage gym kid, right? You see where I'm going? So the idea is not one versus the other. It's to consider variable inputs. And the more inputs I can give to a certain degree, right? There is a limit to this. But the more inputs I can give in my consideration, the more adaptability I can foster. With high adaptability, I become more unbreakable.
So what would you say to the person then that says, well, I teach the deadlift, and it's the most transferable motion and movement to everyday living, or a squat. It doesn't matter the thing. It's the basic squat or the deadlift, and they believe that transfers over to the activities of daily living.
Yeah, I would say, in what way? And you'd say, okay, the deadlift is you're picking up a mass from a dead position. So let's look at the style of strength development, right? So the force development is I'm overcoming resting inertia by picking something up. So from a strength profile perspective, I'm going concentric with not a lot of eccentric loading, not a lot of elastic energy storage. And I'm, in a neurological sense, I'm going through a predetermined path, but in a feedback way, right? So there's not a lot of feed forward because I don't really know how much this mass is going to weigh until I lift it up. So there's a lot of feedback, not a lot of feed forward in terms of the neurological loop. So
what do you mean by feed forward?
Feed forward is I anticipate something. So if I picked up a bar and it was from the rack, right, and it was at my hip, and I went down with it and I went back up with it, that's more of a feed forward. My body knows exactly how much stability is required because I got the weight in my hands. So I can say, all right, got it, right? I can anticipate all this stuff. But when you pick something up off the ground with like a true deadlift, right? I have nothing in my hands. I go down and get it. My body has to quickly use feedback in order to generate and self-organize stability, because it does not know how much it's going to weigh until you start lifting it. That's why people blow their backs out lifting a TV, because they just don't know how much stability is required until they go and grab it, right? Which is very different than traditional exercise in the gym, because traditional exercise in the gym, you kind of got it in your hand and then you start the movement, right? Whereas in life, you generally start the movement by grabbing the weight, right? So a traditional deadlift from a neurological perspective is a lot of feedback. Great transferability, 100% agree with that. A hinge pattern, great. It teaches how to get force in through the hip rather than the spine. Super useful. Another check mark. Yes, excellent. And it teaches the posterior chain to be strong, etc. So there's a lot of advantage to this. So it's a great exercise, right? But in life, we're not going to just go in the purely the sagittal plane. We're going to have abilities where it goes off the midline as we're reaching towards stuff. So this idea of being unbreakable is not just one thing. It's, can I now interact with mass and what we call deadlifting in a variety of different ways, including dead shifting, which is lifting a mass from a dead position, shifting a mass from a dead position. All of these are called dead starts. And dead starts are under the umbrella of starting strength. And starting strength for all the S&C coaches listening in is exactly what it suggests, which is you're going to overcome a body's resting inertia or a mass's resting inertia, which could be me, right? If I lift myself off the ground, or coming out of the blocks if you're athletically inclined. And that is starting strength. It is one form of force generation. There are 6 classifications of how to generate force, including strength expressed, which is power. So go ahead.
Yeah. So you had a lot of terms in there that might be new to people. So let me back up just one second. So when you said dead lifting or dead shifting, and can you explain, I mean, obviously we know what a deadlift is, but you just explained it where you start with the load, typically, whether it's in the ground or maybe you start with it where you grab it off a rack and then go down, versus maybe what you were saying that's a bit more real life is where you're going down, grabbing something and then having to actually lift it up. So can we start with how you describe those two things, and then we'll get into the difference between lifting and shifting?
So a dead start, right? A deadlift would be grabbing something or overcoming a mass's resting inertia. So the start of any, lifting a dumbbell off of a rack, getting a bar off the ground, we would call that a dead start, or we would call that a dead lift if it goes straight up in the air. So the dead part of that phrasing refers to a mass at rest. And we've got to overcome a body's mass at rest. And so that's the first phase, right? We overcome that. So we generate force off of a body at rest. There's a bunch of different nuances that we go down, because we can accelerate, which is changing the velocity of a mass at a certain velocity. And then acceleration on acceleration is called jerk, right? And that's the recoil stuff. That's where all the fascial researchers are looking at how to create tendon resiliency and being unbreakable more in the tendon when you interact with jerk, which is acceleration of acceleration. Like, for instance, you're swinging a tennis racket, a ball comes in and it rattles the tennis racket and rattles your wrist and rattles your elbow, and your elbow is not strong enough because it's not unbreakable enough and you get tennis elbow. That's jerk, right? So the idea of, just going back to the dead start, it is lifting or overcoming or adding a movement or velocity to a body at rest. If I do that in a lifting manner, i.e., I go up in a field of gravity, we call that a deadlift. Now, one example of a deadlift is picking a bar off the ground. That is one example of a deadlift. If you grab the groceries off the counter and you put them on the table, or that is certainly a dead start as well. because you grab the groceries from at rest and you shifted them over from the counter to the table. That's a dead start as well. It's just not a lift. It's a shift.
And that's what I've had this conversation where, yes, deadlift's a functional movement, but very seldom is the thing that we're picking up in a straight line going up and down and right by our shins. It's usually out in front of us. So now that completely changes it. Would you be able to explain, obviously there's the lever distance and different things like that, but from your perspective in the importance of training shifting and what that actually, the physiological impact of shifting?
So when you shift a mass, you move it through a field of gravity, right? So now you're not just fighting gravity directly, you're actually moving it through a field of gravity. So by virtue of doing that, typically when we're upright, you change the lever length. When you change the lever length, you change the force moment or torque moment for that mass in your body and all your joints. So that's also useful too, right? Because yes, by virtue of the phases of a classic traditional deadlift, you're changing the torque moments. I get it, right? So, there are sticking points to every drill, right? Because of the fulcrum and the lever arm and the mass. I get that. But it's accentuated when you shift mass because you're really starting to take mass off the midline, away from the body. And we call that shifting patterns. Those shifting patterns really augment those moments and that leverage. And that's useful because what happens is your body learns that task. So from your nervous system's point of view, you get motor learning and motor control in a different way. But then, your torque profiles and your load paths through the body, the stress patterns that your body receives are going to be different as well. So we want to introduce both deadlifting, which is lifting a mass up, and then shifting a mass, which is picking something up and moving it through a field of gravity. Both of those things are going to build an unbreakable or a more unbreakable system, because from the nervous system's perspective, from joint mechanics and arthrokinematics perspective, from the task and the muscle function, it turns on and off in a different way. All of those things are going to build tolerance and motor literacy, and then strength in different ways in order for the body to be, again, more unbreakable. So we want to introduce both a deadlift and a dead shift because they're different.
Now, the application of that, let's stick with this. Because obviously, and again, I just have to say it, just to make sure we're not talking about taking your 10 RM or your 8 RM, load on a deadlift and then say, okay, I'm trying to shift that through space. That's obviously not what we're saying. What we're saying is, in what you said, is submaximal loads, like the farmer, submaximal loads lifted over time. And so obviously you created the ViPR Pro, and most people in the gym, they kind of use the ViPR Pro as if it's a barbell. So would you mind, and I remember the day that you said, I got this thing, and we were up in San Diego and you took everybody out to the beach and, and threw this rubber thing at us and absolutely crushed all of us. But would you mind explaining, again, and connecting those dots of how you came up with ViPR Pro, and really this is one of the best tools to use to, do these shifting patterns?
All right, so let's go back to your very good statement to start, which is there is a relationship, an inverse relationship between load and degrees of freedom, right? And you anchored into this, so let me reiterate this. As load goes up as a percent of 1 RM, degrees of freedom must go down. So as we get heavier and heavier in the classic deadlift, squat, bench press, whatever we want to do, we need to respect a single plane of motion with unique degrees of freedom. Like, I'm going to bend the knee in the sagittal plane. I'm going to bend the hip in the sagittal. That's it, right? But the inverse is also true, which is as load goes down, our degrees of freedom can move up. And that's useful as well. Because when we looked at, and the genesis of the ViPR and ViPR Pro was all around training hockey players. And we knew the toughest hockey players were the farm kids. Because in battling situations, in athletic positions, in athletic postures, which are never in neutral, by the way, right? They're always in precarious positions, or far more often than not, they're in uncommon patterns because they read and react to the play. Those particular patterns were best served by the farm kid because it was all about exposure. Exposure makes us unbreakable when it's graded exposure and when we can adapt and super compensate relative to that exposure. So that is the training principle, right? So if we look at, all right, farm kids, what do? They interacted with submaximal load in a variety of different ways, right? And if you take a farm kid and you take a city kid and they wrestle each other, advantage farm kid. We all know that. So the answer to taking a bale of hay in the gym without a mess was the ViPR Pro.
Yeah.
Or originally the ViPR, right? The first iteration.
Yeah.
And that was it. Is like, how do we take a bale of hay in the gym without the mess? And, bale of hay, we're not going to just lift it in a single plane. We move with it in a task-based way. And there's a pile of research neurologically, muscularly, fascially, joint mechanics. We want to move omnidirectionally for a variety of different positive reasons, but we do it with graded exposure, as you said before. We don't just blast it out. We expose our body, we get better, we expose it more, we get better, and it's just the training process, right? So as we do this, that was the whole idea, is if you take a mass that was designed to be kind of bulky, like a bale of hay, and you move it around in task-based ways, then you can start to introduce lines of force and neurological control mechanisms that can adapt relative to that style of loading. And that's what we do. That's what we did. And we're not saying this is the best and should replace no. What we are saying is get a little farm kid in your training. Introduce it in. Don't replace anything you're doing. Just introduce a little bit of farm strong in what you're doing. And a lot of that is through, shifting, and a lot of that is through task-based, full body integrated movements of strength and power.
Got it. Now, how would you describe somebody who would say, well, I could just take a cable, like the free motion cable cross with adjustable, pulleys, and I could do that? What's the difference? And again, some people obviously with a lot more understanding of biomechanics would understand that, but for the basic general trainers in the beginning population, what's the difference there between doing that movement with a ViPR Pro or doing it with just a regular cable?
I would say if you took it with a cable and did it, awesome. Good for you.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, fantastic, right? The difference between a free weight and, a variable weight, like a cable or a bungee, is that'll always load you back to the source of the anchor point, right? So if I let a cable go, it's always going to go back to where the anchor point is. If I put the cable low, it's going to be gravity. If I put it high, it's going to be anti-gravity. If I put it to the side, it's going to be through gravity, right? Kind of at perpendicular to the line of gravity, which is great. A free weight, when you let it go, it's going down. So it's a gravity and momentum enhancer, right? So both are awesome. They're just different, right? And so when we pick stuff up and put it back down, you're not really going to be able to do that with a cable or bungee, but there's advantages to cable and bungee too, because if I want to load it perpendicular to the line of gravity, I just put the anchor point to the side of my body, and then it creates a torsion moment to my body that I've got to try to prevent, right? So you get anti-rotation, and that's useful to bring about motor control and force, a line of force in through the tissues that is perpendicular to the line of gravity. It's great, right? So wonderful things to create outcomes of function and, to bolster our ability to be unbreakable.
Now, I want to kind of go through there's a couple of quotes that you've said in casual conversations that we've had over the last couple of months. And in one of them, I believe was said, either it was at the baseball or football strength coaches seminar that you spoke at. And one of them said that the best ability is availability. And what I would love for you to do is now tie kind of everything that we've talked about from the physical realm to how these strength coaches who are training the highest level performers, which a lot that you have, and I know you may have some content to share on the screen as well. But what does that mean? And then again, can you show some examples of why that's so important, especially at the highest level?
Yeah. So that was a quote that was, I mean, a lot of folks have heard that before, but yeah. I first heard it at the NFL Combine. Because when I was interacting with the strength coaches for all the NFL teams, they said, Michol, listen, like when they get to our level at the NFL, they're all elite. Like even the third in the depth chart is elite because they were the best in high school, which was the best in college. They got drafted, they're eligible. They made the roster. They are elite. They're all bigger, stronger, faster. Our job is not necessarily to make them bigger, stronger, faster. They possess all the skills. Our job is to keep them available. And it's like, man, I'm stealing that quote with full recognition and full respect to them, because that quote is so not just for athletic, but how about in life? The best ability is availability. If I'm being a good dad to my daughter, Berkeley, guess what? I'm present. And what is presence? Availability. I'm not on my phone. Yeah, whatever, Burke, like I'm fully present. The best ability is availability. Let's go back to like physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social and economic. The best ability is availability. Am I available to all those things mindfully? So let's kind of go back to what they were talking about in the physical realm. Yeah, like the best ability is availability. I'm going to play a little video on screen here relative to athletes. I'm not sure if you can see this video play right now. For those that are audio mode, what you're going to see is a bunch of elite, top of the game athletes, household names in professional sport, household names. And what they're all doing is they're saying, can we get a little bit of farm strong in our training, knowing that as a professional basketball player, professional football player, professional sport athlete, I'm going to find myself in odd positions, unusual positions of risk. And if I can load them in and tolerate them and deal with them in a suitable way, right there, you saw Kevin Durant doing his pre-warm-up routine I think it was SportsCenter caught that, and they were saying, what is he doing?
Yep.
Right. And so, you see these athletes time and time again at scale, trying to say, we're not going to let go of what we did in the past. We're not going to let go of these traditional, I'll say in quotations, traditional movement patterns to build a certain phase of strength. Super useful, very needed. We still do them all, but we add in these elements. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the guys that stands out that was on here was Drew Holiday. I mean, obviously right now he's in the playoffs, but the guy, just, if you watch him play, he's that farmer strong. He's guarding people that are bigger than him. He's stronger. He doesn't get knocked off balance very often. When he goes up for the ball or goes in for a bucket, he gets knocked and he's able to control himself. So it's amazing, again, to see this, and congratulations as well.
Well, big shout out to my coach, Mike G, who trains him. And he often talks about, and that, it's a term that he uses, loading precarious positions. That's his term. That's where I learned it first. I heard him say it. Phenomenal, right? So he's his trainer, and he will load these positions in a variety of different ways, using a variety of different tools, including, a ViPR Pro. And he does it in a very, very logical way. And the attempt and the goal and the outcomes there is to have an individual thrive in a situation of high adaptability. An athlete needs to be highly adaptable in an instantaneous moment. And let's talk about arthrokinematics. Like, the idea is I want to have an optimal instantaneous axis of rotation. That is a joint that is healthy. If I can maintain an optimal instantaneous axis of rotation, which means my joint's always going to feel it's at the right place at the right time, that is an unbreakable system. That requires the nervous system. It requires, the muscular system. That'll pass, but that requires a nervous system, that requires a muscular system, a fascial system, and joint mechanics that can glide, spin, and roll at the right time. We cannot introduce that solely in the sagittal plane with traditional forms of exercise. Although they're super useful, they do possess, like anything else, everything possesses limitations. And so what we do is we look at other allied things that we can pull in to make an individual unbreakable by building tolerance and building capacity. Because I'll say this, resiliency is not the name of the game. Resiliency, often people anchor into. Resiliency means I bounce back to where I once was, which is useful. It's great. But anti-fragile and supercompensation and adaptability is actually going beyond where I once was, right? And that's the big difference. The big difference is I want to be unbreakable.
And so, we got a couple more minutes, and I would love for you to kind of dive into, some different things that the ViPR Pro is being, is done. And then also, How do you recommend getting started in this, and learning more information with regards to the ViPR Pro, and where can they find that?
Great question. I think the biggest entry point is through strength. If we can understand that strength is defined as the ability for our body to produce force, right? There are different ways in which we can do that. I can produce it once. We call that maximal strength. I can produce it in uncommon patterns. We call that odd position strength. I can do that at a rate of force, which is explosive strength. I can do that repeatedly, right? Contracting and producing a force repeatedly is all about strength endurance. It's all about mitigating fatigue and competing interests of hydrogen and calcium in the body and then in the muscle cell. All these things are super useful. If I can understand what strength really means through the vast expression of it, right? Not just like how strong are you? Which really means in the fitness industry, how can you lift, how much can you lift one time volitionally? That's only one form of strength. If I can understand strength in all of its forms, that is going to be a gateway into, all right, now I can start to interact with kettlebell. I can interact with ViPR Pros. I can interact with, I get how cables, I get how all these things can serve me in a variety of different ways in order for me to be strong in a variety of different ways adaptably so that I can be unbreakable. I would say that beyond anything else, if people can just anchor into that, get their teeth into that, we will not have to we wouldn't have to necessarily, it wouldn't be a tough ask for them to consider various different tools and methodology. I think a great way for folks to understand where to start with different tools, different methodologies, is to really understand strength and strength in all of its forms. If we understand strength to be the ability for our bodies to produce a force, right? That's pretty common, that's pretty known. But if I say to you, Jason, how strong are you? What the fitness industry really is getting at typically is how much can you lift volitionally one time? And that's only one form of strength. If I can say, okay, force, the ability for our bodies to produce a force, there's a neurological component to that. There's a muscular component to that. There's a stability component to that. There's a joint expression and movement component to that. There's a motor control component to that. If I can understand all that, and I can say, okay, there's a variety of different ways in which I need to think about how to produce force. If I do it repeatedly over time, and I got to do it repeatedly, we call that strength endurance. If I could do that explosively, we call that explosive strength, or a rate of force, we call that power. If I do that in an uncommon loading posture, we call that odd position strength. There's your farm kid strength, right? If I do that where I've overcome resting inertia, we call that starting strength. So there are all these different definitions of strength. I would invite all of us to understand each one of these, because when we do, other methodologies, other tools, and other concepts become instantly valid. And it doesn't become a war of ideology. It actually becomes if I truly want to be unbreakable, I need to consider a variety of different inputs. Look at metabolic flexibility. It simply suggests expose your body to a variety of different substrates so your body can tolerate them, including protein in the Krebs cycle, right? People go, oh my God, you're going to kill my gains. No, we're not. The minute amount of protein used as a fuel through oxidative transamination and deamination through the Krebs cycle is not going to kill your chest and your shoulders and your legs. It's not. What it's going to do is build you to be an unbreakable system so that if your body converts to that substrate, it knows how to do it. It's efficient. And with an efficient system, guess what? You can stress it more, and then you can recover it more, and then it super compensates better. Like, why wouldn't you do that?
That's awesome. So, I know that you've got some education that is a bit more fee-based, and then you got some other stuff that is free. Would you mind just sharing that information of, what is available, where it's at, and then obviously we'll put that in the show notes as well.
Sure. So on the IOM side, which is really, where the applied health and human performance. So if we're looking at, physical and mental, emotional, the broad base of things, we've got curriculum that is an applied health and human performance specialist. That's a 4-level course. The first aspect, we call it level 0. It's an introductory course. We can make that available for folks. There's no cost to that. The other levels, as you matriculate through it, has a cost associated with it. So you get specialization as you go through. That's on the broad IOM side. On the tool side, on the ViPR Pro side, we actually make a lot of our education free. And the reason why is because people take a rubber tube and they grab it, and what I'm going with this is they do 2 bicep curls with it and 2 shoulder presses with it. And then you said this earlier in our conversation, they put it down, they think, I can do that with a barbell. I can do that with a dumbbell. And it's like, yeah, those are great exercises, but that's not why we designed this particular product. So, I was with actually a group yesterday out of New Mexico, and, within an hour, they were like, we get it. We get it. And all of a sudden, once you get something, when you get a concept, the application is like, I got it, right? If I said to you the idea of strength, right? Classic strength training in the old school vernacular. And then I tried to give you a bar with some saucers at the end of it to use it. And I called it a barbell. You'd say, I get it. I'm using it all the time. And that utility of whatever product, whatever, always anchors into a broader concept. And what we want to do is give education for free on concepts. We got 4 levels of education through ViPR Pro. It starts with strength. It goes to team training, which we do in water as well. And then it goes to programming and then athletic performance. So we kind of walk through that whole journey of education with the product, and then all the science and concepts that inform the utility of kind of, the product itself and why and how we use it.
And the website is instituteofmotion.com.
Instituteofmotion.com is the IOM site, and then ViPR, ViPR.com. You can follow our handles, Institute of Motion or @ViPR Pro. Those are our handles on social media. We have a lot of information that floats in and around what we talked about on social media as well.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, folks. If you've listened this far, thank you so much for being and being a person who listens to the show all the time. This information is really groundbreaking, and can take your training, take your ability to help other people, whether it's an athlete or whether it's the general population or the aging adult, to really becoming unbreakable. And that's what this is about. There's a lot to learn, but hopefully this gave you some overview of where to go. So obviously I'll work with Michol and being able to help the Lifetime team members get access to this and work through that. So thanks again, Michol. As always, thank you for what you do and what you're doing for the industry.
I appreciate the opportunity to share, Jason. Thanks, man.